My name is Frank Nickell. I'm the director of the Center for Regional History at Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau. And one of my tasks is working throughout the region, serving very much as an outreach coordinator and a resource for Southeast Missouri, an area that I've lived in now for about 33 years. So I'm supposed to know something about the region, but one of the things I've discovered is a very big region with a lot of diversity and a lot to understand and a lot to know. And I'm still learning, I'm still seeking resources, and I'm still seeking answers from some of the people who have lived here for a long time. And there are such great resources in Malden. This is a very historical community in a very historical region. And when I think of individuals such as Alan Black or Gene Howell in Malden, these are people who have a very keen sense of the history of their community. And what I try to do is go around the region and study the towns and reach some conclusion about why they are located where they are and how they've developed as separate communities, what role they have played in the shaping of the region, the state, and the nation. And when I look at Malden and when I look at Dunklin County, it reminds me very much of the early history of this area and of the Mississippi Valley. I think one of the things that's important to recognize about Malden is that it's a very significant part of the entire Mississippi Valley. It's an area that was shaped, has been shaped, and continues to be shaped by moving water. This is an area that years ago, thousands of years ago, the Mississippi River and the Ohio River, all of the water that came down from the glaciation that shaped the upper part of North America and the center part of the nation, all of that water moved southward as the land tilted gradually, about 6 inches a mile, from the what's now the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico. And so all of the water sort of oozed down through the valley. It fell slowly. Water's very heavy, and most people fail to appreciate the very great weight of water. And so this water that came down from the north as a part of the glacial moving and maneuvering moved through the lower Mississippi Valley, built it up, settled it, and carried the topsoil of the north and filled in this whole area as a great basin. Somewhere around the last glacial movement, and we don't know a lot about glaciers because each glacier destroyed the evidence of the previous one. The last glacial movement was about 13,000 years ago. And prior to that time, the Mississippi River ran west of Crowley's Ridge. The Ohio River ran on the east side. And so Crowley's Ridge was an area in between those two water sources. And it continued that way, obviously, for thousands of years until a warming period developed. And that warming period melted the glaciers and created a gigantic lake in what is now the upper Mississippi Valley across the western Great Lakes region. And about 13,000 years ago, the water level of that lake rose so high, the pressure so intense upon the soil, the rocks, the trees, all of the debris that formed an earthen dam. The water level rose so high, became so intense that the dam gave way. And so archaeologists talk about the Kankakee Torrent that saw that water burst forth from that dam and just come crashing down through the valley. And at that time blasted its way through Crowley's Ridge, somewhere south of Cape Girardeau, and created a new river. As the Mississippi River and the Ohio River joined together somewhere above Cairo, Illinois. So the watercourse changed, but the landscape still reflects that original configuration. There's still those sand ridges across southeast Missouri. And if one drives across Highway 60, if you drive across the Missouri Bootheel, a person might have the image that the land is flat. But careful observation will indicate that there are ridges and there are waves across this area. And those waves are really the sand remains of the watercourse of the rivers and the water that moved through here. And so this area, dominated very much by Crowley's Ridge, interesting configuration of the land, and those sand ridges will shape and establish this landscape. So Malden is a significant community because it's on one of those sand ridges that was shaped by the evolution of the landscape and the changing nature of that landscape. And those ridges, of course, were important to the first settlers in this area, and those were Native Americans. And we don't know a lot about them today. We still have a lot of archaeologists working to try and find answers and solutions to who these people were, but we have no idea what they called themselves. We don't know a lot about them, but we do know that they hunted in this area. They lived in this area. They used the land and the river as resources, and they built mounds to get up out of the water. And so after the flood of 1927, which is the first flood that was photographed extensively from the air by new camera techniques, when people evaluated those photographs, they found all of these little mounds. They found all of these parcels of land that were up out of the water, and they couldn't figure out what these were. And so they called in archaeologists who said, well, those were Indian mounds. And so the flood of 1927 called attention to the fact that this was an area that was heavily settled and heavily developed by Native Americans who, because we don't know what to call them, we simply say mound builders. And they really were the first people that we can identify who were residents of this region. They hunted in this area, they fished, they lived off of the land, and they went up on the high ground of Crowley's Ridge to get up out of the water. And they had rivers on both sides of them and swamps on both sides of them, and so they could make a living here and they could survive here. The first Europeans to come into the area were obviously connected to the Mississippi. The Mississippi became a great highway north and south, connecting the St. Lawrence and the Atlantic to the Gulf of Mexico. So we had a lot of Europeans as early as the 1600s moving up and down the Mississippi. No settlement of great population in this region, of course, until the latter part of the 18th century, the 1700s. And not until after the American Revolution in 1783 did the United States have access to the right bank or the west bank of the Mississippi. But Benjamin Franklin, in the negotiations that led to the Treaty of Paris 1783, insisted upon a watercourse and a boundary line of the young United States as the middle of the Mississippi, which provided access to the United States of America to the Mississippi for its full length and its full width. After the boundary line of the United States was determined as the center line of the Mississippi, then we sought to determine what the Mississippi was, what its length was. And so we did not discover the source of the Mississippi until fairly late in history, 1832, before we really know where the Mississippi starts. But that makes the upper Mississippi and the lower Mississippi, as we now call them, one river, rather than the lower Mississippi and the Missouri or the Ohio as a single river. And so the Mississippi Valley, as we know it today, connects from Lake Itasca, Minnesota, to the Gulf of Mexico. After the American Revolution, there were programs developed certainly by the young American nation to move people to the west, across the Appalachians into the Ohio Valley. And so into Tennessee and Kentucky and upper Alabama came people from Virginia and from the Carolinas, primarily Scotch-Irish, who had moved into that area. As these people came from the East Coast looking for land and encouraged by the Land Ordinance of 1785, which guaranteed individual land ownership to people, I think we sometimes fail to recognize that that Land Ordinance of 1785, devised by Thomas Jefferson to move people west, guaranteed land ownership by establishing precise boundaries, such as range, township, and section. We're the first people in the world to develop a precise measurement of land. And I think that changes us. It gives us characteristics that other people don't have. It creates American individualism. And one of the characteristics of people who live in this area is an attitude of independence and individualism. That's given us a strength. And I attribute a lot of that to the landscape that was shaped and property ownership that Thomas Jefferson desired so much. That section of 640 acres, which can be seen from the air all over the Midwest and the Plain States, provided exact boundary lines and guaranteed individual property owners this is their land. And no one can interfere with that. It also moved people out of the villages and changed American agriculture, if not world agriculture. Even to this day, people in Africa, people in Europe who farm live in villages and go out to their farms during the day. But Thomas Jefferson's idea was every family would have a section of land. And so this means 640 acres. You can't live in a village and go out to your 640 acres every day, or you would spend all of your time walking back and forth in an age of no public transportation. So you had to live on the land, and when you lived on that land, it did something to you. It gave you a sense of self-reliance, it gave you a sense of independence, and it guaranteed you your property that no one technically could interfere with. And it gave rise to one of America's great expressions, and that is, get the hell off my property. This is my land, and these are my boundary lines, and I don't want you on my land. We're the most property-conscious, boundary line-conscious people in the world. And I think that has given independence and self-reliance. And so the people who moved from the East were individuals who had had sort of negative relationships with government. They wanted to live alone. They moved out into the hills, but they soon found that those agricultural techniques that worked on the East Coast did not work in the Appalachians, did not work in the clay soils of northern Alabama as well as they had anticipated, or in some of the hills of Kentucky and Tennessee. And so as soon as the Louisiana Purchase was culminated in 1803, there was a surge of people moving west. And they came down America's first great frontier, the Ohio River. Since there were no roads, the Ohio River was the avenue. They came from Kentucky and from Tennessee via rivers that flowed into the Ohio. They came past what's now Cairo, Illinois, and the current there of the Mississippi is generally stronger than that of the Ohio. So they were moved away from the Illinois coast or riverbank out into the center, and so they could not get to the Missouri side until a few miles south of Cairo. And so at landings such as Norfolk Landing or Medley's Landing, All of those people coming down the Ohio in rafts and barges and flatboats, wagons on those, landed on the Missouri shore and then moved inland. Some of them settled in some of those early communities, some of those flat islands along the Mississippi. New Madrid is an example of that, which was started right at the end of the 18th century. But New Madrid was low. It was a little swampy. You couldn't do the agriculture that all of those people from the East Coast had been used to and believed they could make a living in. That's the agriculture they knew. And so they simply sought to duplicate that lifestyle. And so they moved west by whatever means necessary to get across what in the early 19th century they referred to as the Missouri glades, the swamplands, the wetlands. We sometimes fail to recognize that the largest wetland in North America, south of the Canadian border, is southeast Missouri, the Missouri glades. It's about a 2 million acre area formed by all of that water moving south. And so one of the things that these people encountered as they came from Tennessee and from Kentucky and from Virginia, southern Ohio, what they found once they landed on the Missouri shore was a lot of swampland and wetland. And it obviously was not going to be an area in which they would be able to duplicate the agricultural techniques that they knew, the lifestyle that they knew. And so many of them sought ways across to the ridges. On those ridges, those sand ridges in many cases, they believed they would be able to duplicate that land. They found Crowley's Ridge, and they could move north and south. And so through the early decades of the 19th century, people came from the east and settled on these ridges, especially on Crowley's Ridge, but on some of the other lesser ridges. And that shaped the early settlement pattern of this area. They built roads out of the resource that was available, the hardwoods. And so they built plank roads and they built pole roads that at least provided access across the great wetlands of this region. And Malden is on one of those ridges, and so like any number of other communities in this area, Clarkton, Burney, Malden, Kennett, they're on high ground with most of the year, at least they anticipated or they hoped, the land would be dry and they could duplicate that agricultural technique. And one of the things they had here was lots of land. This was an area undeveloped, unsettled, only a few Native Americans residing in the region. And so in the first few decades of the 19th century, people moved in from the east and went up and down these ridges, mostly settling north and south. And so Dunklin County is an interesting configuration because it's a north-south county. People who live in Dunklin County are conscious of whether they're in northern Dunklin County or southern Dunklin County. And I think that's shaped by the landscape. And I think that gives this county and it gives the towns here a bit of their character. But always self-reliant, always independent, always determined to be successful. As the people moved across the Mississippi, looking for land and believing, obviously, as Americans did, vigorously in the future, they found these vast stretches of land with ample water. And one of the things that they write about and they talk about is the health of the land. And that's a very important concept in the early part of American history. People would write letters back and talk about this region as a healthy land, good water, a good air, lots of wildlife. And so they believed that this was the future, this was the place where you could develop that individualism and that economic success that everyone depended upon so much and looked forward to. Thomas Jefferson I think, gave us more clearly than anyone the idea of progress, the belief that you can build a good future, you can shape a life here, as could not be done in the old country in Europe. Some of you may remember your grandparents talking about the old country. Here's a new country. This was a different country. And Novus Ordo Seclorum was the first slogan of America, meaning a new order of the ages, something different. And Jefferson said this is the last opportunity mankind will have to build a society based upon individual land ownership. And so these people from the east came across the Mississippi looking for land and looking for good health, and good water is significant to that. And this is an area, obviously, with lots of water. But it's interesting to see all of the people writing about the health of the land, how prosperous it can become with hard work. So hard work is added to that concept of individualism and private ownership. And so people moved into this region. Steamboats on the Mississippi as early as 1811 and 1812. So there was a rush to the west. And as you came down the Ohio, the only real road to the west, and you passed by Cairo, then southeast Missouri is one of the first sort of receiving areas. And so a lot of people crossed the Mississippi, came into southeast Missouri, and then fanned north and south, up into Missouri, down into Arkansas. If they did not do that, then they undoubtedly turned north and turned right at Cairo and went up to the Missouri and then fanned out. So there are really sort of two receiving areas. One would be the Missouri in the north. The other would be the vast stretches of land here in the Bootheel. And they settled in this area and tried to establish a society that could build for the future. And then, of course, they were shocked somewhat by the great turmoil of the land in 1811 and 1812, the New Madrid earthquake, which is a separate story in itself and has been studied and researched. There's a historian now at Washington University in St. Louis that's at work on what's clearly going to be the most extensive and most intense history of the earthquake of 1811 and 1812. So I'm looking forward to, probably within 2 years, the best study that's ever been done on that earthquake. It's a story that's been told many times, never fully, never extensively, but it obviously changed the region. It moved a lot of the people who settled in the Mississippi Valley to the west. And as they wanted to go west after 1811 and 12, didn't want to settle in the valley, didn't want to settle in New Madrid, they wanted to move to the ridges to the west, which they thought were much safer. And so again, that accelerates the move to Crowley's Ridge and beyond. And so those roads that they built that crossed the wetland brought people into what is now into Dunklin County, from Bernie on the north to Kennet on the south. And Malden is right in the middle of that. One of the distinctive features of Missouri, of course, is its famous Bootheel. And if you take a look at a map of the United States, you'll see that the 3630 line is one of the most famous lines of longitude. Longitude or latitude? It's latitude, right? Sorry about that. One of the most famous lines in America is the 3630 line, which is, I think, the most famous line of latitude across the United States. It's the boundary between Virginia and the Carolinas. It's the boundary line between Tennessee and Kentucky. And so when the Louisiana Purchase is brought about, and Missouri begins to press for statehood with enough population now to meet the terms of the Northwest Ordinance, then the assumption would be that that 3630 line would extend across Missouri. It would become the southern boundary. John Hardeman Walker lived in this area, had one of those Spanish land grants that had been issued between 1763 and 1801, had vast holdings of land. He ran a lot of cattle, and as early as the 1618 period is one of the wealthiest people in the Mississippi Valley. And when there were early efforts to organize Missouri as a state, Mr. Walker desired to be a part of Missouri. Arkansas was still a developing territory and not close to statehood, and so John Hardeman Walker wanted very much to be a part of Missouri. So an exception was made, and the Missouri Bootheel then created to really protect the interest of Mr. Walker, and so it was extended west on 3630, west of the St. Francis River. And that boundary line, of course, has been changed and is continuing to be changed. It's an interesting feature of Missouri. 3630 is extended all the way across the southern part of Missouri, and then is also the top of the Texas Panhandle. And that gets us into the fact that Missouri was a controversial state over the issue of slavery. From 1818 to 1821, till August of 1821, when Missouri was finally admitted as a state, there was a raging battle in Congress over the question of whether there could be slavery taken across the Mississippi River. And Missouri became the battleground of that issue. From 1820, really from 1818 to 1860, Missouri was on the front pages of the newspapers of the nation because it had been such a controversial area in which congressmen north and south fought over the issue of slavery. And so the Grand Compromise of 1821 permitted Missouri to come into the Union with slavery, but would be the only area in the whole Louisiana Purchase that could have slavery. So it, in effect, banned the idea of extending slavery anywhere else in the Louisiana territories except for Missouri. So Missouri came into the nation in the midst of a controversy, and it remained a source of contention over states' rights and slavery to the end of the Civil War. In the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, Missouri went through some very difficult times, and these were not easy decades for the state. It took a long time to come out of the turmoil of the war, the destruction, and the political damage done. The economic issues that emerged in the 1870s and 1880s in southern Missouri, of course, are tied to the railroad. And the great railroad builder of southeast Missouri is Lewis Howell, an individual who had been a lawyer, trained in St. Louis, and moved to Cairo, Illinois, and then moved across the river into Cape Girardeau. As an enterprising attorney, he moved into a town that was becoming a service center north of Malden, and became very interested in all of the railroad development that was taking place across the Midwest, and even in the areas from St. Louis west. And so Lewis Howell, who knew absolutely nothing about railroads, ended up buying 4 books about railroad construction, railroad engineering, and reading through those and determining that he in fact could build a railroad through southeast Missouri. And so in the 1870s, 1880s, Lewis Howell begins to plan a railroad system that would develop southeast Missouri. We still have those 4 books at the archives in Southeast Missouri State University's library, and we have his notations in the columns. So here's a man who's learning as he goes, who had limited resources, had no idea that building railroads would be as expensive as it would be, but realized the great potential of the land down here. And in this area, there was ample wood for building railroad ties. It takes 3,500 railroad ties for each mile of track, and you only get one tie out of a log. And so any place you build railroads, you have to have a lot of railroad ties, you have to have a lot of wood. And so Lewis Howell saw the combination of wood and railroads and built a system of railroads that would connect into Arkansas heading towards Texas. And so his ambition was to connect southeast Missouri to the nation. And he believed that this was the area of potential because of its availability of land and the availability of lumber. And so Lewis Howell sought to put this network together. And he did so by various means, and it brought people into this region. And in the 1870s and 1880s, many of the smaller communities of southeast Missouri that had developed in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s were connected by railroads. There was an awful lot of political maneuvering, and in the latter part of the 19th century, it's very interesting to see how political Missouri was. This was a frontier. This was very much a boom area. And so you have a lot of enterprising people on the make who are trying very hard to develop networks, who are trying to connect, and who are trying to become prosperous. And Lewis Howell was one of those who obviously was very much at the center of that. And the natural consequence, of course, of this is that railroads were extended along the route of those roads that had been developed earlier from the Mississippi into the interior of the land. And so the railroad that came across to Malden followed one of those routes that had previously brought people across pole roads and plank roads from the Mississippi River. And so Malden is where it is because it was developed as a railroad stop, and it was on a ridge, and the railroad connected both to east and west and north and south. And so Malden became an important service center with materials brought down from the north, from eventually by the early part of the 20th century, from as far north as St. Louis, from Illinois and the upper Midwest. And so you have houses here, churches, built of stone, brought down from Cape Girardeau, from the hills to the north. If you go to Clarkton, for instance, the churches there are, for the most part, constructed out of stone that came from the quarries around Cape Girardeau. So the architecture, the service materials that were sold to the farmers trying to clear and develop this land are all brought here by that railroad system developing in the 1870s and 80s. And the growth of the population in these railroad communities will call attention to the need to drain the land. Many of the people that had developed small drainage systems of their own on those sections of land that they had began to talk as early as the 1840s about draining the swamps. And if you could do a network of drainage, then they looked at the map and they saw the grand potential of the hundreds of thousands of acres available that were covered only slightly by water that could be turned into prosperous agricultural land. And so the railroads bring people in. The railroads can take the lumber out. The railroads make it possible to clear the land. And then in the latter part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s, you had a systematic creation of a drainage system that connected all of the little individual drainage systems into one grand network. And so the Little River Drainage System that was formed in 1907 resulted in the drainage of and clearing of nearly 2 million acres of land in southeast Missouri. and it transforms the landscape in a fashion that I think parallels, maybe exceeds, anything like it in the world.
All right.
Once the railroad crossed Malden and brought people in, this was an area that just economically boomed. It was really a boomtown in this fashion similar to boomtowns across the country. You know, America has a tendency to see this as a young country. As we develop land and as we develop the ample resources of this country, there are these booms and busts that happen. And the railroad created small communities in this region, railroad stops that were prosperous and that brought people in, and they became instant service centers for the region. And everyone looked to the future, and everyone believed that this would be the next just golden area. And so you see all of the letterheads, the town of the future, the Queen City of the West. That was repeated throughout all of southeast Missouri and southern Missouri in the latter part of the 19th century. And from the coming of the railroad up to and through World War I, this was an area that just grew. It was prosperous. They were cutting down the trees. They were clearing the land. People made a lot of money off of investment in this land that they could buy for a few pennies per acre. And then once you clear it, sell the lumber for a little bit. Lumber was ample across the country. But then you develop the land and you sell the land. So a lot of people made a lot of money off of land sales and this transformation. So we took this land that had been really the Missouri glades and wetland and transformed it from 95% wet and timbered to 95% cleared. And that provided just enormous success stories about how you can accumulate wealth. And then people developed agricultural techniques and began farming, began making prosperous lives for themselves and their families through agriculture. And World War I had an impact on that because 1920-21, the post-war adjustment from wartime to peacetime was probably the most difficult one we've ever had in our history. And as a result of that, Americans began to change and began to move. And it's after World War I that the tractor began coming in. And so the internal combustion engine will change this area. It's one of those technological items that's going to make a difference in the lives of the people. And so from the 1920s forward, the whole area of southeast Missouri began to go through changes. Growth, prosperity, population increase. It's an area that's populated by people from the South. They're Southern. They're affiliated with the Democratic Party. And many of the counties in the Missouri Bootheel had populations in the 19-teens and 20s that exceed the population today. And they were clearly affiliated with the Democratic Party. And so as a result of that affiliation and that connection, the Democratic Party in the state of Missouri had to have the Bootheel. And so southeast Missouri had a very great political base in the 19-teens and 20s. So when the area grows and the population comes in, it's 90% Democratic. No one could run for office in the state of Missouri without the Bootheel support. And so Bootheel politics takes on that image that it continues to have today, although the numbers today are not as great. In the 1920s, in the midst of all of this growth and development, population surge into the area, Malden developed as a service center and became the community that people came to from miles around to make their purchases, to have recreation, to interact with other people, to find out what was going on where the opportunities were. And I recall reading out in the Malden newspaper an article brought to my attention by a research assistant in the Center for Regional History that Malden was advertised as the complete city. You could come into town and around the courthouse, around the square, you could have all of your needs met. And the rather clever little article said that you could come into Malden, you could go to the restaurant and have a nice meal. You could go next door to a bar and have a drink. And if you got in there and you drank a little bit too much and got in a fight, then the doctor's office was next door and you could go there to be treated. Then if you had your shirt torn, you could go next door to the haberdasher and you could buy you a new shirt. And according to this article, you could just make your way all the way around the square, and the last stop was the grocery store, where you pick up your needs and your necessities, and then get back in your wagon or your car later in the 20s and go back to your farm, out into the hinterland where people made their living. But it was advertised as the complete city. You could get everything that you needed here in town. And that carried this town, and it made this town the service center for a wide region. And that prosperity continued through the 20s up until the 1930s. Agriculture had begun to diminish a bit, prices were falling, but then in 1929 came the symbol of the Great Depression, and this was an area that was very hard hit in the 1930s. People left. They went north to get jobs. And the one industry that continued to thrive and to have jobs in the 1930s was the auto industry in Michigan. And it's surprising to me to see how many people left Dunklin County and went to Flint, Michigan to work in the Buick plant. I've encountered any number of people who have relatives in Michigan or who went to Michigan and then came back to Dunklin County. And even to this day, I think there are people who still have connections in Michigan. Those are really the individuals who sought to escape the depressed economy of this area. All of those farm laborers that were necessary in the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th to come in and farm and till the land with mules and with just back-breaking physical labor, left the area, were tractored off of the land and had to go somewhere else to get jobs, or ended up in just abject poverty. That began to change the area. So in the 1930s, there began to be some WPA projects, some work resources that created jobs, but never big in southeast Missouri. There are not any large WPA projects in southeast Missouri that parallels anything done, for instance, in the Tennessee Valley or in the Columbia River or out in the western states. The Little River Drainage District continued its work, and that opened up more land, but there was a great transformation of land ownership, and people were moved and shuffled. But the one event that really had an impact on the region, created a major change, was World War II. And World War II is socially, economically, and politically, even technologically, the time of the great transformation of America and of Missouri. Missouri has 114 counties, and during World War II, 107 counties lost population. Many of them never to recover that population. There's some counties today that have only 1/3 of the population that they had prior to World War II. So people were tractored off the land, they moved from the rural areas, they ceased being farmers, and they moved to St. Louis, to California. We had approximately 400,000 people who moved to California in the West Coast during World War II. We had about 500,000 that went into the service. We had hundreds of thousands that moved to St. Louis and to Kansas City. So we had more than 1.5 million people who moved during World War II. And those people moved from many of those rural and agricultural communities, such as Malden, in order to get better jobs and to have better lives and to continue that goal that had brought them here in the first place of an optimistic future, of a desire for a bright and healthy future. Malden, for a long period of time, met those needs. Somewhere around World War II, there began to be this transformation and people had to make adjustments, or they fell into some sort of economic decline, and the service center role, not only of Malden, but of many of the communities in this area, began to change. One of the things that I appreciate about what you're doing here, you're celebrating your 125th anniversary, and I think that's great cause for celebration. You have a very rich history here. It's a history not only of the community of Malden, but it's a history of southeast Missouri and a history of the state. So I commend you for what you're doing. I teach history at Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau, and I serve as the director of the Center for Regional History. And we do have in the Department of History a Center for Regional History, and we also have a degree program in historic preservation. And these are two programs that were started 20 years or so ago with the idea of taking the Department of History out into the region and to do history in a broader dimension than just teaching courses in history to students who might want to become teachers. And so what we hope to do and what we seek to do through the department is to connect to the region, to help understand the region, how it became what it is, and to tell the story of Southeast Missouri. Because people want to know their past. People need to know their past. And I think we have a very great obligation to teach our history in its full dimension to our youngsters, to our children. Because it's difficult for us to ingrain the values, the attitudes, and the dedication to this country and to this society if the students don't know their history. And one of the great resources of studying the history of Malden is this museum. And so the Malden Historical Museum is dedicated, as I understand it, and as I know it and have observed it over the years, dedicated to the telling of the story of Malden and of the region. It has resources. It provides interpretation. It has people who are dedicated to telling who lived here, how they lived, why they lived here, and how their attitudes and how their dedication and how their very great work contribute to the lifestyle and to the opportunities that exist here. I think it's in a very great need for our youngsters to know their past, and one of the great delinquencies today among our young people is a sense of history. And so I would urge all of you to involve your children, to involve the young people of this community into your celebration of the 125th anniversary of the city of Malden. And to all of the people who live in Malden, all of you who have worked on this project, I congratulate you on a rich and great history. And I hope that 100 years from now, that students will still be studying the history of Malden, the history of this region, and trying to understand how and why this region has become as it is today.